This is The Other Side with Damien Coury.
G'day and welcome to The Other Side Australia, Episode 9, uploaded on Friday, October 23, 2020. I'm Damien Coury. This is the show for the quiet Australians, where we give you a centre-right perspective on the news of the week, in a country where liberty seems to be something a lot of people don't really care about much. Or maybe it's just taken for granted because it's been a couple of generations since it's been under threat like it is today. This is the show where we let the sound bites breathe a little. We don't chop everything off after 10 seconds, where you get some time to take it all in, where you can stop and rewind if you miss a bit or jump ahead if you're not so interested in something. Yep, I'm making excuses. This is our longest show ever. Actually, I'm not making excuses because we've got some great stuff coming up. Today's show is a huge one. We have a special feature on the culture of the woke people. What is woke? What is identity politics? And where did it come from? What is critical race theory? And why do people keep saying we're in a culture war? Well, we're going to explain it all and find out. And we'll hear part of a recent interview with British comedian Andrew Doyle, creator of the hilarious Titania McGrath character on Twitter. We'll also explore the growing threat of the rise of the Greens to our government stability in Australia and the changing nature of the left in our country. And today we have a very special segment for you to explain one of the most disturbing stories to come out of the United States in a long time. It's the Hunter Biden, Joe Biden, Ukraine laptop story, which you may or may not have heard about this past week, depending on whether you normally consume conservative or mainstream media. The reason it's such a disturbing story is that half the media are ignoring it. Today, we argue that they shouldn't be, that censorship of the conservative point of view in America and Australian mainstream media is now completely out of control, and we will make it all very simple for you and explain how it ties to the impeachment of Trump last year and the disproven Russia collusion allegations. A lot of stuff made very simple for you and easy to understand. I mean, I had to do it for myself, so there you go. It's a segment you absolutely don't want to miss. Alexandra Marshall will tell us about a new growing international security threat to Australia that you've simply got to know about, especially as the spy agency is now telling us that our politicians are being targeted. And I'm pleased to announce that this episode of The Other Side Australia is completely COVID-free, just like most of Australia. Seriously, folks, I don't know how much more we can say about the ridiculousness of Dan Andrews and Anastasia Palaszczuk and Mark McGowan's policies. I am just out of breath on all that. These people simply should not be in power in our nation, not just because of their left-wing political ideas, which I'm not a fan of, but more because of their general lack of professionalism, experience, expertise, and nuance in senior management and leadership and in managing crisis like this. We simply need better people. 4 babies died that probably didn't need to because they couldn't get the neonatal care they needed. I just have no more words. If these are the governments you want to vote for, this is what we're going to get. And today we're just going to concentrate on exploring other things, more important things, more philosophical things, like the threat of woke philosophy. Let's begin. It's not uncommon these days to hear people lament the polarization of Western culture and the growing divide that seems to be occurring between the left and the right. Everyone except for the Russian and Chinese governments, that is, who seek to benefit from that polarization and division in the West and have entire government agencies devoted to fueling it through planned campaigns of foreign interference. It's popular to blame Donald Trump for this polarization and division, to blame conservative politicians like Trump and Johnson and ScoMo for fanning the flames. But that view confuses cause and effect quite significantly, and it puts the cart well before the horse. Because long before Brexit and Trump and Boris and ScoMo, the seeds of division were being sown in our universities and working their way through our media and into the workplace through the HR department. And Brexit, Trump, Boris and ScoMo represent the backlash against the philosophy behind the division and polarisation, not the cause of it. They may be taking political advantage of anger about it, but they didn't bring it about. Identity politics, or woke culture, as it's more popularly called, this tiresome over-analysis of every social problem through the lens of race, gender, economic circumstances of birth, and even sexuality, didn't come out of nowhere. And it didn't happen as an organic thing that evolved naturally and nicely out of our gradual cultural shift towards more acceptance and enlightenment and tolerance that you'd expect from a great culture like the modern West. Nope. Woke identity politics evolved out of an actual academic field of social science. And I use the word science very loosely. That field is called critical theory. Critical theory argues that all our social problems are influenced and created more by societal structures and cultural assumptions than by individual and psychological factors. In other words, it's not your fault and there's nothing you can do about it, let the government fix it for you. It's the opposite of classical liberalism, which says, no matter what deck you're dealt in life, you can change, especially if the government just gets out of your way. But the not your fault philosophy has got a lot of appeal to a lot of people, since not all of us are born into wealth and good fortune. Life ain't fair. But it simply isn't the philosophy which built our modern Western liberal democratic societies. And if we embrace it, it will be the end of our societies, because it's grounded in a self-defeating psychological lie that's not supported by human nature and reality. Even people suffering the daily torment of mental illness and crippling depression and anxiety have got to pull themselves up and carry on to eventually heal. Wallowing in victimhood is lethal. We know that now as a scientific fact. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't be a caring society, that we shouldn't have sympathy for the agony of people whose brains aren't working too well for a while, to care for the aged, the disabled, and the sick. But we cannot embrace a philosophy which wants a huge central government to control making everything equal. That is totalitarianism. It's impossible to make everything equal for starters, and it leads to a living hell. If critical theory sounds familiar, it should. It's Marxism, the late 19th century dogma that infected the thinking of the 20th century to the point that we ended up with 2 bloody world wars and 100 million people being murdered during so-called peacetime by their own Marxist governments. Marxism is the grand old uncle with really bad ideas who just never seems to die out. Critical race theory began as a theoretical movement in law schools in America in the 1980s. It was a reworking of critical legal studies on race issues. And today, kids at our universities in Australia can undertake an array of subjects on gender and race theory. There's even a non-profit organisation called the Australian Critical Race and Whiteness Studies Association, the ACRAWSA, which describes itself on its website as a professional association for scholars researching in the interdisciplinary field of critical race and whiteness studies. The goal of the association is to provide a network for established scholars, early career researchers and students, it says, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, and to provide opportunities to develop the field. The association promotes scholarship and other activities which critically investigate and challenge racial privilege and the construction and maintenance of race and whiteness. If that sounds racist to you, that's because it's racist. This is why I support any moves by the government to ensure that taxpayers are not forced to fund these courses. I don't want the courses cancelled, because if you shed light on bad ideas, they die out faster. Classical liberals like me don't do cancel culture. But we mustn't force people to pay for this in our tertiary education. And that is why the government is raising fees for humanities degrees and lowering them, as it should, for the real sciences and technologies. Because if you really cared about the working class, my dear lefty mates, you wouldn't want them paying via their taxes for the kids of the rich intellectual elite to fill their heads with nonsense. I do hope, though, that the redirection of funding doesn't hurt too much the teaching of fact-based history courses and the classical humanities and ideas that made Western culture the greatest and most liberal and just man has ever known. Something pretty good happened in the UK Parliament at Westminster this week. The Minister for Equalities in the Conservative government of Boris Johnson is a black woman by the name of Kemi Badenoch. Minister Badenoch is a brilliant thinker, and she sent a message loud and clear to British high schools this week that teaching children that white privilege is a fact is breaking the law. The minister told the House of Commons that there is a dangerous trend in race relations that should not be taught in schools. Here's the UK Minister for Equalities, Kemi Badenoch.
What we are against is the teaching of contested political ideas as if they are accepted fact. We don't do this with communism, we don't do this with socialism, we don't do it with capitalism. And I want to speak about a dangerous trend in race relations that has come far too close to home to my life. And it is the promotion of critical race theory, an ideology that sees my blackness as victimhood and their whiteness as oppression. I want to be absolutely clear. This government stands unequivocally against critical race theory. Some schools have decided to openly support the anti-capitalist Black Lives Matter group, often fully aware that they have a statutory duty to be politically impartial. Black lives do matter, of course they do. But we know that the Black Lives Matter movement, capital BLM, is political. I know this because at the height of the protest, I've been told of white Black Lives Matter protesters calling, and I'm afraid I apologize for saying this word, calling a black armed police officer guarding Downing Street a pet nigger. That is why we do not endorse that movement on this side of the House. It is a political movement, and what would be nice would be for members on the opposite side to condemn many of the actions that we see this political movement instead of pretending that it is a completely wholesome anti-racist organization. There is a lot of pernicious stuff that is being pushed, and we stand against that. We do not want to see teachers teaching their white pupils about white privilege and inherited racial guilt. And let me be clear, any school which teaches these elements of critical race theory as fact, or which promotes partisan political views such as defunding the police without offering a balanced treatment of opposing views, is breaking the law.
That's the UK's Minister for Equalities, Kemi Badenoch, speaking in the House of Commons this week.
You're listening to The Other Side with Damien Curry. Not the sort of show you'd hear on the ABC. And we're not forcing you to pay for it either.
British comedian and writer Andrew Doyle, who writes the hilarious woke parody character Titania McGrath on Twitter. If you need a good laugh, and who doesn't these days, do check out @Titania McGrath, McGrath, on Twitter. It's hilarious parody of the overindulged woke millennial class. Anyway, Doyle appeared this week on the Modern Wisdom podcast from Italy, where he's hiding away writing a book. And he says the woke lunacy has really exploded in the past 12 months.
It has exploded. When I last spoke to you, I was often accused of exaggerating the problem, and people would say, well, you know, you're just complaining about the behavior of a few rogue students here and there on university campuses or a few nutcases on the internet. And well, I've been proven right, haven't I? Because now it's not that. It's demonstrably not that. The evidence of everything I've been writing about and talking about for the past 5 years is absolutely everywhere. It's incontrovertible. And if that sounds arrogant, so be it. But there you go. I told you so.
The prophet has arrived.
I fucking told you so, and you did nothing. And you attacked me. You just attacked me. I am Cassandra. You didn't believe my warnings, and here we are. You know, had you heeded my prophecies, perhaps this could have been evaded.
There was like a trending in a world of woke, sort of where's it gone this year?
Yeah, so it's been a kind of just a concatenation of unfortunate circumstances. You know, we had the obviously the pandemic and the lockdown, and this created this kind of tension and this kind of this sense of frustration. It meant a lot of people were spending more time on the internet rather than the real world, which means that they have a skewed perspective of how things are going. And then all of a sudden it explodes because of the death of George Floyd. So there's this, you know, what starts out as very important, legitimate protests against police brutality. I'm personally very nervous about any kind of overreach of the state, as you know, because you know about my work. So I do believe instances like that do require rigorous response and rigorous protest. But very quickly, it became quite clear that this wasn't about George Floyd anymore. It was about this whole host of other issues, and it was actually more a kind of catalyst for the culture war to explode into the mainstream, which is exactly what happened. And then you have all major corporations, all major businesses, civic institutions, schools, universities, absolutely everyone in lockstep over basically issues they don't fully understand. You know, I mean, when the BBC, for instance, and Sainsbury's, as of this week, telling their employees to read White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo, which is a book which is, I suppose, the most popular example of critical race theory that we have at the moment, but it is a very shoddy piece of work, which has been widely discredited and doesn't have the kind of academic respectability. Once you move beyond that sort of niche of the kind of postmodern offshoots, such as critical race theory, disability studies, fat studies, gender studies, intersectional feminism. Once you go beyond all that, people don't take Robin DiAngelo very seriously. It's such a dangerous, divisive, backward philosophy of life. It's the idea that you divide us into oppressed and oppressor, irrespective of our personal circumstances, and it's racist in every way it is possible to be racist. It degrades people of color by telling them that they're always going to be victims, that they will never achieve anything that they deserve to achieve, and it's racist against white people because it tells them that they're all oppressive and racist. And in particular, Robert DiAngelo, who will claim that if you deny your complicity in white supremacy, that just proves you're a white supremacist.
Gee, where have I heard that kind of logic before? The Salem witch hunts, anyone? Andrew Doyle told the Modern Wisdom podcast that there's a whole new language you have to master before you can even debate with people who buy into critical race theory.
It also makes people rightly nervous. They understand that, you know. Most people are concerned about the anti-racism in terms of unconscious bias training, implicit bias training, dividing people up. I mean, Sainsbury's literally created an online safe space for their black employees. I mean, how patronizing is that? So people are nervous about this, but they don't want to be seen to be opposed to anti-racism. It's a very clever phrase that they use. But what people have to understand is that anti-racism is a rehabilitated form of racialized thinking. In other words, it is a form of racism. And if you really care about combating racism, as I do, then you will oppose anti-racism. And you'll go back to the liberal approach. The liberal approach to combating racism. And the reason why that's a good thing is we've got the past 6 decades of progress which prove that it works. And sure, it hasn't achieved a complete utopia where racism doesn't exist. That will never happen because we live in a society of human beings and there's always going to be some nasty pieces of work amongst us, right? But the absolute best way, as has been proven by recent history, is the liberal approach, is that you tackle racism rigorously whenever it occurs. What you don't do is create this faith-based philosophy where there are nebulous power structures that only people like Robin DiAngelo are qualified to detect. And therefore you implement policy on that basis in the government, in the arts, in education, in the media, absolutely everywhere. And then you're solving problems that may or may not exist on the basis of this deity that you've created. That's not the way to go about this. And we know this is the case. So people who do believe in those liberal values, those decent values of equality and fairness and looking out for people and ensuring that people aren't mistreated in society and discriminated against, those are the people who need to advance the liberal agenda, the social liberalism that has served us so well for so long, that is now being utterly demolished before our eyes.
British comedian Andrew Doyle speaking to the Modern Wisdom podcast, and there is a link to the full 1-hour interview in our program notes today. So what has all this got to do with Australia? Well, I think we're in trouble, folks. I think we're in cultural trouble. That's going to lead to political trouble if we don't correct it and wake up pretty fast. In the ACT territory government election for their 25-seat local parliament they have for the territory, the Greens secured 5 seats Labor 10, and the Liberals 8. There are 2 seats still to be decided, and the Greens are likely to get one of those, making a total of 6 out of the 25 seats. Meanwhile, last week, a YouGov poll revealed that a whopping 16% of people who live in the Greater Brisbane area intend to vote Green at the Queensland state election on October 31. That's 1 in 6 people. The Greens' federal leader, Adam Bandt, says his party is aiming to hold the balance of power in both Queensland and federally. Their focus now is to win 3 inner Brisbane seats in the Queensland state election. The problem with the Greens is that they don't just represent environmentalism. Some would say they don't even represent environmentalism. They simply use green issues to push a radical left-wing policy agenda. A simple glance at the Greens' website and you can see the critical race theory all over the place. Some of their candidates are quite bright. Some are anything but. And some are radical, to say the least. The Greens are a watermelon party. Green on the outside, red in the middle. They're more Extinction Rebellion than Greenpeace. Take the Greens candidate in the city of Ipswich near Brisbane, who goes by the name of Mr. Raven Wolf. Raven sports long locks of purple hair. And don't get me wrong, I'm not a purplist. Some of my best friends have some purple hair. But what worries me most is that Raven's biography on the site doesn't say anything, nothing, about what Raven has ever done for work or if he has any qualifications. Just a minor omission from a bio, wouldn't you think? But that doesn't matter because he says, quote, I want free lifelong education. I want a public safety net that's above the poverty level. I want enough public housing so we don't have people living on the streets. As if the rest of us don't also want all those things, Raven. I'm pretty sure Raven wants fairy dust to descend from the heavens and wrap us all up in a warm, cosy blanket with our every need taken care of forever. Maybe that explains why there's no work experience in his bio. For a second, I thought Raven had forgotten to mention how he was going to pay for all these goodies. But then there was this bit. Quote, most of all, I want the corporations and the rich to pay. And there it is. Proof, once again, that the left don't love the poor quite as much as they hate the rich. Ah, yes, the rich. Those evil people that hang on to all the money without investing and spending it and creating jobs and supporting the economy. And the corporations, those evil organisations that have to be highly efficient, effective and accountable or else go broke. Made up of all the rich people who actually have jobs and contribute value to the economy. Raven goes on to say that the big end of town, gee, where have I heard that before? The big end of town needs to pay their way. So I guess a sliding tax system where the rich pay almost half of what they earn in tax just isn't good enough for good old raving Raven. Did you know, for example, that half of all the tax paid in Australia is paid by the top 15% of earners? And 17% of all tax paid is paid by that evil top 1% we keep hearing about. Never mind that these people are mostly the ones who've taken the risks and worked their butts off to make the money to pay the tax on. Some of them, of course, inherited, but their ancestors worked their butts off and, you know, the rest of the story. And I'm sure all these productive people will be just delighted to stay in Queensland working their butts off so they can hand most of it over to Raven and his mates. But some of them, you know, they might just decide to quit work and retire at Noosa or leave for New South Wales. So that's where Raven's little plan for free everything, paid for by the rich and their evil corporations, may come unstuck a little bit, don't you think? Folks, we have got to grow up as a nation. We've got to lift our cultural conversation. We've got to move beyond this infantile, childish narrative of rich bad, poor good. It's simply not how the world works. Well, Queensland already has one Raven in the state's one Chamber of Parliament and could see 2 more. That'd make 3, and if it's a hung parliament, which is quite likely, that could possibly leave the Greens holding the balance of power. What got the Greens over the line in the one inner Brisbane seat that they won at the last election was environmentally concerned LNP voters. who thought it'd be a nice thing to do to put Greens 1 and LNP 2 on the ballot, thinking that they could have a warm, fuzzy feeling of being all environmentally virtuous while ensuring their vote would ultimately count for the LNP. The Green won't get up, of course. That's the LNP, the party that protects and fights for free market liberalism that helped make them and Australia wealthy. But that little game didn't quite work out so well for them. The Green candidate got enough votes to beat Labor, and with Labor's preferences to then beat the LNP incumbent. And that is how Queensland got its first ever Greens Member of Parliament, Michael Berkman, in the Brisbane Inner West seat of Maiwar. Michael is an articulate and intelligent guy, good-looking, smooth, personable, not the Raven Wolf type, but someone who is deep in the far-left neo-Marxist thinking that government can fix everything and all it needs to do is raise taxes and redistribute some fictional endless supply of money apparently being clung to by all these so-called rich people. There's that oversimplistic left-wing narrative again. Will it ever die out? Berkman supported and participated in the Extinction Rebellion protests that have caused traffic chaos in the Brisbane CBD in the past year or two. Running against Berkman is LNP candidate Lauren Day. Lauren Day is a former Channel 10 Brisbane TV reporter. She and Berkman clashed face-to-face in an online debate hosted by Brisbane's Courier Mail newspaper this week. The moderator tried to pose a question about tribalism and polarisation in American politics, as if the right side of politics in Australia was solely responsible for that. Lauren, who had her election signs vandalised with sexist slurs during the campaign, gave the young moderator an education on where that polarisation is actually coming from.
Yeah, I think we are seeing that. I think it's really sad. I think that we have actually seen cancel culture in Maiwar, even with all the vandalism of signs. You can't have a different opinion anymore, and it shouldn't be like this. We should all be able to have different opinions and get on with each other. And I do feel like absolutely the left are not interested in anyone else's opinion, and they will try and silence people. I'm here for that reason. I wanted to run to stand up for the LNP and for our values, because I was seeing so many times people get silenced. They're afraid to say what they feel. If they do, they're shut down. People won't even be friends with them anymore, and it's wrong just because they have a different opinion. It's okay to be successful in life. It's okay to have aspiration. I want to raise up a new generation of women who are proud to even be called women now. I mean, there's so many different things with the left ideology, and people are worried. I do hear that quite often, especially in our schools. You know, it's starting in our schools, and that's another reason why I wanted to run, which is what I said earlier.
Lauren, thanks for that. I think that's answered my question, but maybe in a different way than we might have thought. Look.
Yep, you got schooled, kiddo. That's Lauren Day, the Liberal National Party candidate for the Brisbane electorate of Maiwar in the Queensland state election. And coming up next on the other side, Ray Rudowski joins me for our special Hunter Biden, Joe Biden, Ukraine analysis. What is going on with that story? What does it all mean? Where did it all start? We're going to give you a very simple, clear, step-by-step explanation of the whole thing in a 20-minute special coming up right after this quick message on The Other Side Australia. If you'd like to support The Other Side Australia, simply go onto our Subscribe Star page and search up The Other Side Australia. You'll be able to subscribe for $5, $10 or $20 a month to support our marketing and promotion efforts. And the best way to support the podcast is to tell your friends about it. Share it on social media platforms and let everybody know to help our audience grow. This is The Other Side Australia, your weekly news summary from a conservative, classical, liberal and libertarian perspective for the quiet Australians. And joining us now, as always, to talk about North America, our North American expert, Ray Radowski, the cool Canadian. How are you, Ray?
I'm great, but the wheels on the Biden campaign bus appear to be falling off.
Yes, they're not going round and round, as the children might say. All right, let's just take a step back, because Australians are swamped with information. We've got all our own things going on down here that are just way over the top. And there just isn't enough headspace for this American stuff. So I'm just going to try and guide everybody through this step by step. So let's go back to the beginning. Hunter Biden is the son of Joe Biden, right? And he and his business partner joined the board of a Ukrainian energy company called Burisma back in 2016, I think?
2014.
Sorry. Okay, back in 2014.
While his father was vice president and overseeing Ukraine as part of his portfolio in the Obama administration.
Exactly. So in my mind, that's it. I mean, that in itself is enough to really say that some red flags should have gone up immediately, and Joe Biden and Barack Obama should have said, hang on a minute, Hunter, this isn't good. Now, Joe Biden said in January this year that it was a mistake for his son to have taken that $80,000 per month board position back in 2015. And he promised that should he become president this year, none of his family members will have any involvement with any foreign government at all. And Hunter Biden, too, said that he made a mistake for which he bore full responsibility, according to the Washington Post. Now, the story doesn't end there. The second part of the whole drama, stay with me here, folks, is that there was a man named Viktor Shokin. Viktor Shokin was the Ukrainian government's prosecutor general. He was in charge of large investigations into corporates in particular. And Shokin was investigating Burisma over stuff that happened before Hunter Biden joined the board, but nonetheless would have affected Burisma's future earnings pretty badly. So this was going on. The Ukrainian government was investigating Burisma. When Joe Biden was vice president, he strongly pressured the Ukrainian authorities to sack Shokin. He warned the Ukrainian authorities that if they didn't sack Shokin, the country could lose around $1 billion in loan guarantees from America.
Why is the vice president or the then vice president of the United States trying to get a prosecutor fired from investigating a company in which his son is on the board of? That alone, that sentence alone is enough to make anyone kind of think, what's going on here?
Yeah. Yeah, and people did ask that question, and the response from the Democrats was that Shokin's firing wasn't just because of Biden's threat to withhold the $1 billion of loan guarantees. They said it was because of Shokin's repeated failure to act against corruption, and to be fair, there were concerns that a number of other Western nations had about Shokin. And it is true that the firing of Shokin followed a push for anti-corruption reforms developed at the State Department and coordinated with the European Union. So maybe Shokin wasn't a good guy and Biden was right to push hard for him to be fired. But it all doesn't look great. And then to make matters worse, Biden spoke at a Council on Foreign Relations event and bragged about how he forced the then Ukrainian president, Petro Poroshenko, to do the firing. Let's have a listen to that.
I remember going over convincing our team, or others too, convincing us that we should be providing for loan guarantees. And I went over for, I guess, the 12th, 13th time to Kyiv, and I was supposed to announce that there was another $1 billion loan guarantee. And I had gotten a commitment from Poroshenko and from Yatsenyuk that they would take action against the state prosecutor, and they didn't. So they said they were walking out to press conference. I said, no, I said, we're not going to give you the $1 billion. They said, you have no authority. You're not the president. The president said. I said, call him. I said, I'm telling you, you're not getting the $1 billion. I said, you're not getting the $1 billion. I'm going to be leaving here. And I think it was, 6 hours? I said, I'm leaving in 6 hours. If the prosecutor's not fired, you're not getting the money. Well, son of a bitch. Got fired. And they put in place someone who was solid.
So, Ray, that was Joe Biden bragging about the fact that he used American funding as leverage to get the president of Ukraine to fire the special prosecutor. Maybe not because he was investigating Burisma, but boy, it sure looks bad when his son is on the board of that company and would have stood to directly benefit from that investigation not going ahead. Now, this brings us to last year and the phone call that led to the impeachment proceedings against President Trump. Trump spoke to the new Ukrainian president, Zelensky, on July 25, 2019. And according to the now famous rough transcript of that phone call, he said this: "I heard you had a prosecutor who was very good and he was shut down, and that's really unfair. I'd like you to do us a favour, though, because our country has been through a lot and Ukraine knows a lot about it. There's a lot of talk about Biden's son, that Biden stopped the prosecution, and a lot of people want to find out about that. So whatever you can do with the Attorney General would be great. Biden went around bragging that he stopped the prosecution, so if you could look into it, it sounds horrible to me." Okay, that's from the Trump call transcript with the new president of Ukraine, Zelensky, in 2019. Trump was then impeached because of his move to freeze military aid to Ukraine just after that July conversation. The Democrats say that was to pressure Zelensky to investigate the Bidens, and the call was improper. Trump says it wasn't, and the call was perfect. Trump said it was totally appropriate for him to ask Zelensky to look into what went down with Hunter and Joe and Shokin because it needed investigating. Zelensky repeatedly said that he felt no pressure from Trump to establish any investigations into Biden. The Democrats said, of course he'd say that. The military funding was eventually released anyway. The Democrats carried on with their impeachment, but it didn't get past the Republican-controlled Senate. Now, a cynic might say that the entire impeachment was a really good way to confuse everybody and muddy the narrative so that the Biden allegations would get lost amid all the impeachment coverage. And they'd be right. The focus wasn't on Biden and anything that he might have done wrong, any conversations he might have had that he shouldn't have had, pressuring and using American aid in the wrong sort of way, to whether Trump had had an improper conversation and was using American aid in the wrong sort of way. Pretty clever strategy if you want to confuse the picture, Ray.
And the interesting thing about that is, while it's clear from that clip you just played that there was some sort of quid pro quo for, in the Biden scenario, fire the prosecutor or you don't get $1 billion in U.S. aid.
Right.
There doesn't seem to be any evidence of quid pro quo in the Trump situation, where he asked about whether or not there's going to be any investigation into the Biden dealings in Ukraine. That prompted the impeachment, which did not go any further because the Republican Senate didn't push for that afterwards.
So the new episode that's been happening this week, Ray, explain to us what that's all about. A laptop turned up in Delaware.
Well, apparently, according to the New York Post story, which is the 5th largest newspaper in the United States, while it may be a tabloid, it does have some cut through. Hunter Biden dropped off his laptop at a shop in his state of Delaware to be repaired and never picked it up. And then as a result of time passing, the shop owner was entitled to keep the laptop. When he opened it up, he discovered a lot of things on that laptop that were quite shocking to him, that included all sorts of emails that outlined things, his various business dealings, photos depicting drug use and other sordid behaviors. So he turns that over to the FBI, keeps a bunch of copies for himself, and the FBI do nothing with it. So then he turns it over to Rudy Giuliani, who then turns it over to the New York Post, and then we have this situation where the story blows up. Interestingly enough, it only blows up in conservative media. Joe Biden refuses to comment on it, and the mainstream media doesn't report on it. CNN, MSNBC, Washington Post, New York Times, they all just either talk about it as some wacky conspiracy theory, or they just dismiss it entirely as a smear.
Which I can't believe, given all the steps that it took to get here, which we just talked about. I mean, this is if this was Trump, right? You can't imagine the ruckus and the how this would be stirred up and beaten up as a story.
Well,
and we've got much more credible, possibly credible information here than we've ever had on the Trump phone call or any of that sort of stuff. So you would think the media would be all over it, and they're just ignoring. This is deliberate ignoring. It's quite terrifying.
It's a real story. And you've got these guys, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, who are the icons of investigative journalism. And there's none of that in this situation. These emails sort of start to tie in what did Joe Biden know at the time of his son's involvement in the Burisma deals and things like that, and effectively compromise him as a potential presidential candidate. Like, why he's a presidential candidate despite all of this stuff that was sort of known in the past is bizarre. But the fact that he's refusing to comment on it, and now the media is not only refusing to cover it, but most importantly, you talked about the various stories. The big story in this situation involving the laptop and the emails is the big tech censorship of that story.
Yes.
Twitter blocked the story from being shared, and then closed down or blocked the New York Post's Twitter site until it takes down those stories.
It was extraordinary.
I think that it is extraordinary because while the normie voter might have looked at all this stuff and kind of said, oh, well, politicians are politicians and they're always going to do stupid things. The First Amendment, freedom of speech, freedom of the press are something that now clearly are under threat in this election. And that, I think, is where the pivot has gone from the emails and the laptops and this complicated Ukrainian story to look at how big tech sides with the Democrats and censors any content or news stories that it doesn't like.
Yeah. I mean, that has become the dominant story now. It's quite extraordinary and quite scary. Ray, the biggest rating cable TV news show in America is the Tucker Carlson show. Tucker Carlson's been onto this story quite heavily this week. Let's just have a listen to his take on the big tech thing when Jack Dorsey, the founder of Twitter, issued a statement.
We have just heard from the CEO of Twitter, Jack Dorsey. He tweeted this, quote, "Our communication around our actions on the New York Post article was not great, and blocking URL sharing via tweet or DM with zero context as to why we're blocking, unacceptable." Huh. Writes like a child. Manages the company like one, too. By the way, the Biden campaign is able to call the story, quote, discredited because big tech is trying to discredit it. No reporter has taken a look at the story and concluded, oh, sure, this is a Russian fabrication. Putin did this. That's ridiculous. So the Biden campaign is using big tech as a pretext for not responding. And big tech, of course, is trying to prevent you from reading it at all. Where does this go from here? If Biden's elected, you really think that the big tech companies are going to stop doing the bidding of their masters in Washington? Not a chance. You think big tech is going to suddenly think, oh, you're allowed to think for yourself? No.
No. Okay, that's Tucker Carlson from Fox News, which, of course, is the Murdoch network in America, affiliate of the New York Post, which is a Murdoch newspaper which broke the story. In Australia, we've seen this story run pretty heavily on Sky News, which is Murdoch's outlet here. The Democrats have tried to run with the narrative that this was all part of an orchestrated Russian smear campaign and some kind of Murdoch media conspiracy. Adam Schiff, who is the chair of the committee that did the impeachment against Trump, a prominent Democrat, he's the one who's been out very, very loudly saying that this is all a smear campaign and that the Russians' hands are all over it. That has been absolutely dismissed now by all of the government agencies involved in the investigation, saying that there's absolutely no indication of any kind of Russian involvement here. I really think this is a case of the Democrats just trying to muddy the waters. I still don't understand why other media are not picking up the story unless they are totally in the pockets of the Democrats. It does all seem to be quite scary from that point of view. Initially, there was some questions about the veracity of the laptop. Was it real? How did it get there? How did all this sort of strange story about how it came about? but it is understood to be real. That's sort of being investigated, and the Murdoch press is standing very firmly behind the idea that it's real, Ray.
That's right. You've got a situation where the bill of sale has been verified. Nobody from the Biden campaign has denied this. And then you've got people that were involved in those emails, including a couple of Hunter Biden's former business partners who are attesting to the fact that, yeah, I have these emails as well. So in other words, the recipient or the sender of some of those emails can verify that this is not a plant, this is not a hoax, this is not some sort of conspiracy. It's Hunter Biden's laptop with Hunter Biden's emails and a bunch of photos of Hunter Biden doing some very unsavory things.
One of the senior reporters at the New York Post that's working on the story is the Australian columnist Miranda Devine. She's known pretty well in Australia and as a long-time Sydney journalist. Miranda's now in New York. She has spoken about the fact that how she can be so certain that the laptop is the real deal. Let's have a listen to that.
So Facebook and Twitter had absolutely no problem, as you said, 2 weeks ago with Donald Trump's leaked tax returns. They had absolutely no problem when CNN played audio recordings of private conversations that Melania Trump had had. No problem with the entire Russia collusion stuff, the hoax that was perpetrated by the New York Times and the Washington Post, etc. And no problem at all with the Steele dossier when BuzzFeed was spreading that everywhere, that, you know, is shown to be utter nonsense and was utter nonsense on the face of it. So Twitter and Facebook, the social media giants, are lying now when they say that they're just trying to protect the public and, you know, stop malicious information, and then they need to do fact checking and that they don't like material that's unauthorized. I mean, so much of journalism is publishing so-called unauthorized material that other people don't want you to have. And we don't live in communist China quite yet. And yet these oligarchs in big tech are treating us as if we are fiefs in their authoritarian regime.
And already your critics are lining up. They will say things like, well, let's look at some of the names that are involved, like Bannon and Giuliani. These guys know how to play dirty pool. How would you respond to that charge alone?
Well, this has absolutely nothing to do with Russia. That's just ridiculous. And secondly, yes, Rudy Giuliani was the one who brought the laptop, Hunter Biden's laptop, the hard drive, to us. That's true. But that's because Hunter Biden left his laptop at a Mac repair shop last April in Delaware, and then he failed to pick it up. He abandoned his laptop. And the guy who owns that Mac repair shop sat on it for 8 months. He's owed money by Hunter Biden for fixing it because it was water damaged. And then he's watching the television. He sees the impeachment stuff. It rings a bell with him. He has a look at what's on the laptop or the hard drive. He contacts the FBI. Doesn't contact Rudy Giuliani or anyone else. FBI. They come along. They pick up the laptop. Then he hears nothing. The FBI's done nothing. So he contacts a senator, conservative Senator Mike Lee. Sends an email, no response. Sends an email to a conservative group, no response. Sends an email to Rudy Giuliani because he saw him on television talking about the whole issue about Burisma. And lo and behold, Rudy Giuliani is the only one who pays attention to this guy. There's the story. And so, you know, there's no apology for us publishing actual emails from Hunter Biden's laptop, which show that his father, quite contrary to his protestations that he knows nothing about Burisma, knows nothing about his son's business dealings overseas, emails show that Hunter Biden arranged a meeting for his father with one of the top executives at Burisma.
And that's Australian journalist Miranda Devine from the New York Post, the newspaper in New York that broke this story, speaking on television there to Good Morning San Diego. Ray, I just want to pick up on that point that Miranda made about the fact that the media, the mainstream media, are suddenly worried about the veracity and details of this when there seems to be quite a large amount of circumstantial evidence to prove that there is, you know, at least some legs to this story and certainly questions that need to be asked and it should be being covered. She made the contrast between that and how quick the media are to jump on even the slightest rumor about Donald Trump. You know, no matter how poorly researched or flimsy the initial information might be.
Compare this story with the story from the Atlantic magazine a few months back suggesting or alleging that Donald Trump a few years back made some disparaging remarks about fallen U.S. soldiers on a trip to France And again, that was debunked, but it was played up huge in media, even though there were no legitimate sources. It was one of those 4 unnamed sources type of stories, whereas this is a laptop that clearly belongs to Hunter Biden and has his pictures all throughout it. There's no dispute of this. And the last time that Joe Biden appeared in public was a number of days ago, and it was to buy ice cream or buy milkshake with his granddaughter. And that was what the media were covering. And as soon as somebody started to ask a question about the scandal, he laughed it off. The rest of the media laughed at the reporter, and Joe Biden stormed off.
The rest of the media laughed at the reporter. It's the same sort of thing we're seeing in Melbourne when journalists try to challenge Dan Andrews. I mean, the pack mentality, the group think that journalists are supposed to not let themselves fall into professionally and when they're operating collectively, but they do. Ray, I'm going to ask you to join us a bit later on in the show for your regular segment when we'll have a quick look at the town halls and the polls and where things are at the moment in the election campaign. But thanks very much for helping us out with our Hunter Biden, Joe Biden, Ukraine special recap. In the coming weeks, Australia's spy agency ASIO is going to issue advisories to all federal politicians on how to avoid getting tangled up in foreign interference plots. ASIO's Director General, Mike Burgess, told a Senate hearing this week that overseas intelligence services have been trying to curry favour with Aussie politicians by taking advantage of their secret weaknesses, sexual preferences, infidelities, and greed.
We see evidence of intelligence services deceptively cultivating politicians at all levels of government who will advance the interests of the foreign countries. In the coming weeks, I will write to all Commonwealth parliamentarians to warn they are attractive targets for those trying to steal our secrets and manipulate our decision-making.
The advice to MPs would tell them what to look for and how they should handle it. Burgess confirmed that ASIO had recently disrupted a plot in which an Australian-based foreign national and a team of foreign intelligence officers were trying to recruit multiple Australian security clearance holders to access sensitive information about our intelligence activities, particularly those directed against their home country, according to a report in The Australian. Burgess said local government councillors were the most frequently targeted by foreign agents, potentially because they'd later go on to higher office. He also repeated his past warning that there were more foreign spies and proxies operating in Australia now than at any time since the Cold War. Well, joining me now is the Aussie queen of conservative, libertarian and classical liberal Twitter, Alexandra Marshall. And Alexandra's been doing some research and writing lately about an increasingly powerful defence cooperation alliance that's headed by Russia and China and expanding into the Middle East, Alexandra.
Thank you very much. It's lovely to be back.
We're going to talk about a thing called the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the SCO, which was formed in 2001 in Shanghai, China. It's a little cooperation organization between China and Russia. And in 2017, I think it expanded to include India and Pakistan.
Yes, so the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is an evolution of the Shanghai Five, which was China, Russia, Kazakhstan, and Tajikistan. And as you correctly said, it was expanded first under the Shanghai Five to include a few more, and then once it became the Shanghai Cooperation, it included Uzbekistan and most notably India and Pakistan. Now, the reason that's really curious is because India is a standout as not being particularly friends or aligned politically with the other members of the organisation. So when India joined, particularly in light of Pakistan joining, there was a lot of debate both in India itself and with the rest of the world of what on earth India was doing inside this shifty, it's definitely a shifty organisation, considering that it also has waiting in the wings Iran, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and the Arab League nations. And the whole point, of course, is to open up trade routes through the port of Iran from China, to overturn the reliance on the US currency and create a new economic level inside Asia, and also to basically changed the military alliances of half the world's population. So it's not a minor alliance by any means. It's quite a powerful group.
Right. And this is not like
yeah.
APEC, which is just a business economic cooperation alliance. This is a cooperation alliance on security, military activities, as well as culture and economics.
Well, and most crucially and importantly, it was created as a way to circumnavigate the UN because two of its members have veto powers on the UN. And the most crucial part of the Shanghai Cooperation is its Pact of Non-Interference, which allows it to break humanitarian charters inside its own nations with the assurance that none of the other countries inside the pact will interfere. That means that if China is interring and abusing Uyghurs, nobody else in the pact will interfere, and they'll even veto the UN from looking into it at all or closely, which is why the Shanghai Cooperation language is often quoted by Arab nations when they're asked why they don't care about China's abuse of their ideological citizens. And I don't think a lot of people are aware of that is actually the reason why China is allowed to get away with it.
Okay, the Uyghurs being a Muslim minority, and of course that should be of concern to those Arab states that we just discussed there. So what is this? You're saying that they're waiting in the wings, the Middle Eastern states. Tell me a little bit more about that and how this thing might expand.
So some of the Middle East nations and the other stans, they have what they call observer status. Others have applied to join and are being considered. Some are involved in the trade and military parts of the pact without actually being official members. The US applied to be an observer and was rejected offhand, so the West is definitely not allowed to be a part of this pact.
Okay, so observer states include Afghanistan, Belarus, Iran, Mongolia. There's also dialogue partners, which include Sri Lanka, Turkey, Nepal, Cambodia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia. It's a big organisation and just getting bigger and bigger and bigger as an alternative bloc.
Yeah, it might interest you that the last time that it was flexing its muscles was actually to do with Hong Kong, where the Secretary General of the SCO, Vladimir Novov, issued a statement that SCO member states oppose external forces interfering in Hong Kong affairs. And they issued quite a few different statements, including the use of force and threat, and force without the UN Security Council's approval against countries or groups which seek to monopolize global or regional affairs out of selfish interests. In other words, they were collaborating together in order to stop any external countries from weighing in on China's creep on Hong Kong. So they are using their political force and muscle to start changing the way we see geopolitics in the world. And they are a significant, shadowy operation that has immense power that not a lot of people have clocked onto yet.
So India being in part of this is quite odd, as you mentioned. We're a very close ally to India, so is the United States, and they are no friend of Pakistan or China. So what is India doing in there?
Yeah, so this is the question that not just us, but also the US has been asking India while they were over there. What are you doing joining this group? And as far as I can determine, you've got to remember that India is surrounded by members of the SCO. And although they may be ideologically aligned to the West, they also have a look east policy that they've had this special relationship with Russia after the Cold War. So they are closer to Russian interests, who are obviously one of the main founding members, than we would like. And the worry about India being part of this pact is that Australian politicians believe that should anything happen in the Pacific with China, India will be there to back Australia up. And they take that for granted. I've actually asked several of our leading politicians, and they just say, yep, India will be there, they'll help us. But if they've joined this pact, that actually prohibits them from engaging in any kind of help, military or trade, for Australia in the case of China blocking off the South China Sea or anything like that. So we have to be really careful about what they've signed and why they've signed it. But I do think that the whole thing has a big crack forming in it after China decided to unwisely attack India's borders. When they did that, Russia actually stopped sending some of its military arms to China for the first time in many, many years upon India's request. So I do suspect that China may have blown it by acting too soon as far as showing its cards.
Okay, so that plays well for us. So let's talk about Pakistan now, Pakistan's involvement.
Yeah, so Pakistan, which likes to play a threat of nuclear war every other week with India, the reason that they are in there is, of course, China is pouring money into Pakistan via the Belt and Road Initiative.
Yeah.
So they are building enormous infrastructure programs into Pakistan, not just to acquire territory in there, but they are also able to move arms across the border along with trade. So India would be quite worried about China empowering Pakistan. And so by joining the pact, they at least are granted a way of observing what is going on inside that group to do with their own interests. So these are some of the theories that are being thrown out there as to why India decided to join that pact. Because as you say and correctly point out, it's controversial even inside India that has been signed.
So, Alexandra, it's also interesting to note that the United Nations Human Rights Council, the UNHRC, has just had Pakistan join as a member state. What's the significance of that in light of the SCO alliance?
Well, I think it shows the way in which the United Nations as a general concept has been eroding since it was first created. And let us not forget that it was created to stop socialist and communist powers rising to control the world. And here it is, completely overrun by socialist and communist nations in league with dictators in the third world. So as a general concept in its entirety, it's pretty morally bankrupt. And it just seems to stand to reason that the 2021 to 2023 period for the UN Human Rights Council now is chaired by China, Pakistan, Russia, Mexico, Cuba. It's not exactly a beacon of human rights inside those nations. And they are meant to be telling us how nations should treat their citizens. And considering that China, as we've just discussed, has deliberately, and Pakistan have deliberately entered into an engagement to find a way around committing human rights violations without the UN being able to interfere, they certainly should not be able to be in charge of the UN as well, because they will persecute nations who are not part of their SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So it's basically creating a monopoly that has no interest in human rights and is generally interested in gaining global power.
Yeah, it's scary stuff. What are the implications for Australia, and what's your concern about the way Australia is handling it? Do you have any views on that?
Only that our politicians are extremely naive when it comes to how the world is shaping up for the next 10 to 20 years. When you speak to our politicians, they are almost blind to not only the rise of China, which they've only woken up to because the people inside Australia have started to point out that China is abusing the WTO, the trade relations, and it's becoming obvious that they can't deny now that there is a global problem coming. But as far as the rest of the world, like India and Russia and most of the Arab League, I don't think our politicians have half a clue what's happening.
Oh dear. Okay. Well, what do you think? What do you think we should be doing then?
Well, first of all, we have to start talking about it, and our mainstream media has to start to understand that it's not just the UN in charge of the world. There are other larger organizations like the SCO, which has a larger sphere of influence than the UN, that are controlling the political game. And while ever they're allowed to operate without scrutiny, they can be a serious danger to the future of global politics.
Oh boy, and that just takes me right back to the beginning of the show today, which is, we have got to grow up and we've got to wake up and we've got to stop acting like a country that doesn't have any international threat, doesn't have any need to be internationally competitive, can afford to sit around worrying about critical race theory and what pronouns we're calling people. The Western world needs a massive kick up the backside, and we've got to get our act together. Alexandra, a little bit depressing, but thank you very much for your time once again, and we'll catch you next week. Thanks so much for your research too.
It was a pleasure.
The best way to get the podcast is to have it emailed to you. To get on our mailing list, simply drop us a line at theotherside@gmail.com. That's the other side, AUST, all one word, @gmail.com.
And it's time to welcome back to the show Ray Radowski. Ray joined us earlier, of course, for our Hunter Biden, Joe Biden, Ukraine special. But we do have to talk about the presidential election campaign. So welcoming Ray back in his usual spot on the show. Ray, the third and final US presidential debate is happening on the same day that this episode of the podcast goes live, which is Friday, October 23, Australia time. The second debate, of course, didn't happen. Instead, we had two town halls last week, one for Biden and one for Trump. They ran on different networks at exactly the same time. And I have to say, after watching both, that the contrast between the two was quite astounding.
It's interesting that the moderators are very much partisan in both those situations. So you get this sort of situation with Joe Biden where he's kind of asked, almost like Mr. Magoo, what do you think? Is this okay? Meanwhile, the moderator in the Trump town hall was cutting him off, doing all the things that the liberal media claimed that Trump was doing to Biden. This moderator was doing to Trump, and it seemed to be okay. Like, it's okay if you interrupt Trump. It's okay if you are rude to the president. But when the president tries to defend himself, when the president tries to go on the offensive, oh, orange man bad. So that's what you get to see in that situation. I don't see that it really had any impact. I think it might have brought out more sympathy for the president from his supporters and from those who might be sitting on the fence looking at this thing and saying, you know, why is that woman being so rude to the president when they accused the president of being rude?
What struck me about it was the fact that the Trump town hall started with 20 minutes of him being grilled by that interviewer. And the questions were, you know, white supremacy and all of this sort of, you know, stuff that he's constantly denouncing, but they keep asking him to denounce it. Contrast that with the Joe Biden one, where the moderator is George Stephanopoulos, who's a former, you know, Democrat operative. And we've since learned that there were plants in the town hall. People asking the questions were actually Democrat operatives themselves. And Joe was just given real easy questions, and it started straight off the bat with going to questions from the audience. It was a totally different format to what Trump was put under.
If you talk to people or you watch any of the coverage, it's all attacks on Trump, but there's no actual coverage of Biden. The presidential candidate in one of the most important elections in U.S. history hasn't been seen for 4 days, while there's this growing scandal about pay for play and his son's sordid dealings. And that's okay. Like, media's not really kind of going to pursue that story, that angle. It's like, leave them alone. Let them prepare for this debate. And by the way, this debate that's coming up is really meaningless. It's not going to make a big difference to anybody. I don't think that the viewership is going to be as high as the first one. And so for Joe Biden to disappear for 4 days to prepare for this, when the only situation that's going to arise out of it is Donald Trump grilling him about these emails and his play situation.
But I think that is going to make it. I think that is going to make it a ratings winner. I think people are going to want to watch it now just to see that. I mean, what is the story? Joe Biden's got to answer these questions before this could really, really impact the result.
I think that this could impact the result around that small group of still unmotivated voters who are thinking about this election and saying, I don't like either candidate, I'm not going to vote. They might look at this and decide, I'm going to vote now because of what I saw. But
is it a small group?
Again, it's hard to tell with the polls because they've been so skewed that it's unknown. I was reading somewhere that there's a large proportion of the American electorate that just doesn't vote, like in any election. And it's important to get those people out. Or if you're trying to discourage, an attack on your candidate, to get them to stay home.
Yeah, exactly. And it's something that's a bit different to Australia because we have compulsory voting. So
that's right.
You forget that. But a lot of this is just about getting people out or getting them to stay home if they're not going to be voting for you.
What I think is more significant in these last 2 weeks is the enthusiasm factor. You've got a presidential candidate in Trump who's just come out of COVID. He's recovering from COVID, and he's everywhere. He's holding these rallies. He's without a mask. He looks like this vibrant guy. And then you've got his opponent who claims to have a double-digit lead in the polls, and the last appearance was buying milkshake with his granddaughter and being asked what flavor he got. Like, that's the extent of the campaign.
Yeah.
And I think that when Trump, and I'm going to go on record as saying, I think it's going to be a Trump slide. I think he's going to win a greater proportion of both the popular vote and the electoral college vote in this election, because you've got a flawed candidate and you've got a flawed vice presidential candidate. Like, how did Harris end up on the ticket when she's from the most liberal state, so they don't need to win it? And she was the first Democratic candidate to drop out of the Democratic presidential primaries. So she wasn't very popular with those that were, in a position to vote for them back then.
Well, you heard it here first, folks. Ray Radowski says there's going to be a Trump slide, and we will see what happens. I am not going to argue with you, Ray, because in 2016 I made that bet over that steak with you, and I lost big time
because
when you predicted the Trump. I know.
That was because you weren't reading the same media coverage that I was reading. Now you are. So
I learned my lesson. I learned my lesson, and I predicted the Scott Morrison victory 3 weeks before May 18, 2019. So there you go.
All the information is out there. All the information is out there if you start to know where to look, or if you start to dig a little deeper.
Okay, the truth is out there. I know you're not a conspiracy theorist, okay? I know you're not. I know you just look into the alternative media for us, which is great, because it gives us that different perspective that we want to have on this show. It's not much point tuning into this show and hearing the same perspective that you're getting on the ABC. We want to give you a different perspective with the same depth that you would get on the ABC. So, Ray, thank you very, very much for your time once again. Great talking to you, and thanks also for the help with the Hunter Biden thing and making it all very clear to us. We'll catch you next week.
I'm looking forward to next week.
And that is it for yet another episode of The Other Side Australia, coming in at a whopping 69 minutes this week. Holy cow. Sorry about that, folks. It just keeps getting longer and longer, but we did have to do those specials. And you can always fast forward or listen on 1.25. I don't think I sound too good on 1.5, but, it's up to you. All right. Great to talk to you all again. Hope you can share the podcast with all of your friends, and you have a great week, and we'll catch you at the end of next week with another summary wrap of the news of the day from a conservative, libertarian and classical liberal perspective for the Quiet Australians.